Thish Gaming back again with my TBC class picking guide, this time covering the Hunter. So just as a quick refresh, the parameters I'll be discussing are boss DPS, overall raid DPS, class and spec utility, PvP strength, overall desirability in raids, and my general thoughts. So let's get started with Beast Mastery Hunter. Theoretically, they have the highest cap on single target damage. Not only do they absorb buffs very well, but they also have Feign Death, which essentially allows them to ignore threat as a mechanic. They just get to ignore it, and that's a huge bonus. Use it smart, use it correctly, and you will never have to worry about threat on any boss. As far as your raid damage, it's still good. It's, I would say, average. There are some classes that can really pump in AoE situations, but the Hunter AoE is more limited. You have multi-shot with 3 targets and a cooldown. Traps have to be placed in melee. So your AoE is essentially just doing really high sustained damage target by target, which, depending on how the pulls line up, can still be really good and lead you to having really high raid damage, but it won't be the same as far as like a person getting 8 targets on chaff. Now, covering their party utility, it's fantastic. They actually have one of the best party buffs, and it's a major factor in why they have such high damage. And they also have some great raid utility, which I will cover as well. But now we get into some downsides, which is their PvP strength. They're still very capable in open world and BGs, but not so much in arenas. The LOS, tighter quarters, not as good for them. And resilience means that the old thing of popping someone with an aim shot crit into another crit doesn't really happen as much. They're more of a drain class with Viper Sting. Now, you can still do well, but it'll be harder for you than for other classes. And for desirability in raids, very desirable. Most raids will want at least 3, usually 4 hunters. So overall, they're a great DPS class on single target. They have amazing threat management and long range to basically just, you get to stand outside of boss mechanics, which is amazing. Additionally, you have some very powerful utility, and that makes you a complete package DPS. Now, you do require a more specific group setup than your competition for top DPS slots, but I'll cover that. That being said, they are not actually as brain dead as people would have you believe. Now, I'm sure you've heard of one-button macro rotations, that sort of thing. And while it is true, you could use those, there's a lot more to being a great hunter than just pressing one button. There are times where not using the macro will be more DPS, and a major part is your pet. Now, a lot of your damage as a BM hunter is tied into your pet. Your party buff is tied into your pet. So keeping your pet alive, which due to them getting AoE damage reduction and using some of your stats, is easier. But still, if you aren't careful and send your pet in, you can end up with a dead pet and be casting Revive Pet rather than DPSing. So, a good hunter will micro their pet to get maximum damage and keep their pet alive. Now, for raid spots, bad news here. Everyone knows Hunters is really good. Like, you're watching this expecting me to say Hunters are really good. So you may have some competition for raid spots, as people who want to do high damage and want to play a simple class will gravitate towards it. Now, there's some ways that you can differentiate yourself and make yourself more likely, but I would expect competition for hunter spots. Maybe not as much as the other DPS class, which I think you'll know which one I mean, but there will be competition. So covering the spec utility, I want to pay special attention to Ferocious Inspiration. This is the bread and butter of BM, and it is unique and stacks. So each hunter that has this in a group applies it to everyone else. So you're getting 9% if they all proc. That's amazing. Just a flat 10% damage, nearly 10% damage increase for 10 seconds on your pet crits. Great. So everything in this group is set up around making you do as much damage as possible and your pet crit as often as possible. Now, an additional thing that you'll want is improved Hunter's Mark, not just for the melee, but for your pet too. If you have improved Hunter's Mark, your pet now benefits from the AP. More pet damage, more damage for you. Really good. As far as class utility, I would be remiss to not mention Misdirection. Threat caused by your next 3 attacks is redirected to target raid members. So you have less threat, the tank has more threat. Using this basically increases the ceiling on the raid's DPS every time you use it. So it's important that you use this ability, do a bunch of damage, and make your tank have more threat. So not only do you have feigned death, but you can increase the raid's threat cap as well. Amazing utility to be able to bring as a DPS class. So next up we have Survival Hunter. And Survival Hunters still do good single target damage. Don't be mistaken, still very strong on the single target damage front. But they are not as good as BM. They don't provide Ferocious Inspiration as well, which is the primary group buff. So you can kind of put them in the same level, just lower for single target damage and raid damage. However, they bring a unique debuff, which is really strong. And oftentimes, you'll want to have your Survival Hunter bring an Owl for a boss debuff, which I'll cover later. So they have the same PvP strengths and weaknesses as our hunters, and having one Survival Hunter is basically mandatory for an optimal raid comp. So much like a BM Hunter, you can do good damage, but you sacrifice more. As the utility spec that sacrifices damage, you may actually find it easier to get a raid spot. You know, you are the person that's willing to say, you know what, I'm going to do a little bit less damage, but the whole raid as a whole will perform better, and that could get you the spot. So really the reason that you're brought is this exposed weakness, which is when you crit at ranged, everyone gets 25% of your agility as attack power. Now, what does this mean? How much agility will you have? Well, you might have 1,000 agility, so this is 250 free AP every time you crit to everyone for 7 seconds. This is tank threat, everyone's damage, your damage, all the pets' damage. Very huge buff that you can be giving to everyone in your raid. Now, as far as your class utility, there's Misdirection and Screech. Screech doesn't have to be run by the Survival Hunter, but BM Hunter is going to go for maximum DPS output pets, so having Screech on your Survival Hunter is good. It's an melee attack power debuff for bosses and actually trash as well. Putting Screech out when your Prot Paladin is tanking 12 mobs will reduce their damage taken significantly. And due to the way that damage is calculated, this can lead to actually massive damage reduction, especially on moves that are not part of auto attacks. So things like if you played classic like Broodlord's Mortal Strike or Unbalancing Strike from Twins, those off the global cooldown instant attacks scale really hard with attack power. So if you nerf attack power, they do significantly less damage. This can be the difference between your tank dying and your tank living. So having one in the raid is generally considered to be a good thing. Now, what do I mean by Hunter requires more setup? What I mean by this is that you want to have certain buffs in your raid in order for you to reach your full potential. Your competition class, Warlock, doesn't really require this same level of setup. They need a couple of things, but it can be spread anywhere in the raid. You will want a specific group setup, and if you can ensure this, then you will be getting your best results. So in your raid, you're going to want an Arms Warrior to provide 4% damage to both you and your pets. You're going to want a Boomkin to provide 3% hit to melee and range. So 3% hit is for your pet in melee and 3% ranged for you, so you can wear less hit gear. And Sunder Armor or Improved Expose increases your damage. Lastly, but not least, is Seal of Wisdom being judged. You really want Judgment of Wisdom on the boss. Being able to get 74 mana back is huge. You are a mana hungry spec. You really don't want to be using mana potions though, because there are powerful DPS potions in TBC. So having a chance on every attack and spell to get 74 mana back is huge for your long-term throughput. So if at all possible, make sure that Wisdom is being judged on the boss. You will see the difference in your mana bar. And once again, you don't really want to stack agility instead of being able to use intellect. Sorry, had that backwards. You don't want to have to stack intellect in order to have the mana pool to sustain through a boss. You want to be using DPS cooldowns rather than mana potion cooldowns. So really, get this on the boss. Party buffs are just as important, and this is really how your party is set up. You want to have a feral druid in your group and an enhancement shaman, and then as many other BM hunters as you can. Generally 2 other BM hunters. So, leader of the pack, 5% crit for you and your pet. That means ferocious inspiration is up more. That means you are providing exposed weakness more. This is just a flat out huge buff to you and your pets. Grace of Air, also a buff to your pets. More crit rate, more damage for you, more crit for you. Unleash Rage, 10% melee attack power. I believe this is actually all attack power, but if not, it's still a bonus to your pet. More damage out of your pet. Remember what I said about microing them being important. So if you have all of these stacked up, this is really the Exodia for a hunter. You have all of these, you are getting every single buff put on you, and it doesn't matter about threat because you just reset it every 30 seconds. So, in summary, Hunter is one of the best single target DPS classes in TBC. They have good utility and unmatched aggro control. They can both be simple to play and offer a ton of tricks with pet micro, trinket swaps to further increase your DPS beyond just one button. They are looking to be extremely popular for good region, and you should expect competition for raid spots. You may have an easier time if you're survival, but you'll also see your personal DPS go down. Once again, to reiterate, you will see the most success if you can get an enhanced shaman and a feral druid in your group. Those two are your best friends. Make friends with them now. Otherwise, happy huntering in TBC.